The snow has not stopped for 11 days. Across the valley, the drifts have risen to swallow the tree line, and the sky hangs low and colorless, pressing down upon the earth like a suffocating hand. There is no wind now. There was wind before, a screaming thing that tore through the gaps in the shelter walls and scattered the embers of dying fires, but it has passed. What remains is worse: silence. A silence so complete that it seems to have weight, to have texture, to fill the lungs with each breath like cold water. The people inside the shelter do not speak. They stopped speaking days ago, conserving the energy that words require, conserving heat, conserving everything. A child sits near the entrance, wrapped in hides that no longer smell of the animals they came from, but only of smoke and human sweat and something else, something sour and desperate. The child watches the snow through a gap no wider than a finger. Nothing moves out there. Nothing has moved for a very long time. This is the deepest winter. This is the season when the world withdraws its mercy entirely. The hunting parties went out 8 days ago, then 6 days ago, then 4 days ago, and each time they returned with nothing. Not because they lacked skill, not because they were careless or weak, but because the animals have vanished. The deer have moved to valleys beyond reach. The rabbits have burrowed so deep into the frozen earth that no snare can find them. The birds that remained through autumn are gone now, fled south or dead in the snow, their small bodies buried beneath drifts that will not melt for months. The fish in the frozen river are unreachable, sealed beneath ice, too thick to break with the tools that remain. There is nothing left to hunt. There is nothing left to gather. The stored food ran out 5 days ago, and since then, there has been only waiting. The human body enters starvation in stages, and each stage carries its own particular horror. In the first hours without food, the body barely notices. Glycogen stores in the liver sustain blood sugar, and the muscles continue to function as they always have. But those stores are small, enough for perhaps a day of normal activity, far less when the body is also fighting to maintain its temperature against the killing cold. When the glycogen is exhausted, the body turns inward, beginning to consume itself. Fat reserves become the primary fuel, broken down into ketones that the brain can use in place of glucose. This is the body's emergency protocol, written into human DNA across millions of years of evolution, a survival mechanism designed to bridge short gaps between meals. But this gap is not short. This gap stretches toward the horizon with no end in sight. By the 3rd day without food, the metabolism begins to slow. The body reduces its energy expenditure, lowering its temperature, slowing the heart rate, diminishing all non-essential function. The cold makes this process both easier and more dangerous. Easier because a cooler body requires fewer calories to sustain. More dangerous because the margin between conservation and hypothermia narrows with each passing hour. The people in the shelter move less now. They sit close together, sharing body heat, their breathing shallow and synchronized. When they do move, they move slowly, deliberately, every gesture calculated to spend the minimum possible energy. Even blinking becomes an act of conservation. The psychological effects begin to manifest around the 4th day. Hunger is not merely a physical sensation, but a mental one, an obsession that colonizes every thought, that transforms the mind into a single-minded instrument focused entirely on food. The people dream of eating. They dream of hunts from years past, of summer feasts, of berries bursting with juice, of meat sizzling over open flames. They wake from these dreams gasping, and for a moment, just a moment, they believe the food is real. Then reality returns, and the despair that follows is worse than the hunger itself. Some of them begin to see things that are not there, hallucinations triggered by the brain's desperate search for sustenance, movement in the corner of the eye, shadows that seem to take the shape of animals, the smell of cooking meat where no meat exists. But the experienced ones, the elders who have survived winters like this before, know that despair is the true enemy. They have seen what happens when people surrender to panic, when they waste their remaining energy on futile searches or consume things that should not be consumed. They have learned, through generations of accumulated wisdom, that the only path through starvation is patience. Absolute, unwavering patience. The discipline not to act when action is useless. The strength to wait, to endure, to trust that the world will eventually relent. The fat reserves of the human body can sustain life for weeks, but only under specific conditions. The body must remain as still as possible. Core temperature must be maintained through external means, through shelter and fire and the warmth of other bodies, so that calories are not wasted generating heat. Water must be available, because dehydration accelerates the breakdown of tissue and confuses the already struggling metabolism. And the mind must remain calm, because stress hormones increase caloric expenditure and erode the very reserves upon which survival depends. The people in the shelter understand these rules instinctively, even if they cannot articulate them. They have learned them the way all humans once learned them, through the brutal filter of natural selection, through generations of ancestors who survived because they knew how to be still. When the fat reserves begin to diminish, the body turns to other sources. Muscle tissue becomes fuel, broken down to provide the amino acids and energy that fat can no longer supply. This is the critical threshold, the point beyond which damage becomes permanent. The heart is a muscle. The diaphragm is a muscle. When the body begins consuming its own structural tissue, it is consuming the machinery of life itself. The people grow weaker now, their limbs trembling with the effort of the smallest movements, their voices reduced to whispers. They cough more frequently, their immune systems failing as resources are redirected away from defense and towards survival. Infections that would normally heal in days now linger for weeks. Small wounds refuse to close. The very young and the very old are most vulnerable, their reserves smallest, their systems least resilient. Archaeological evidence of these desperate winters has been found across every continent where humans faced seasonal scarcity. In the caves of southern France, dating to the depths of the last ice age, researchers have discovered bone assemblages that tell a story of meticulous resource extraction. Every scrap of usable material was consumed. Long bones were cracked open for their marrow, and the fragments were then boiled repeatedly to extract the last traces of fat. This practice of marrow extraction appears in the archaeological record with striking consistency wherever starvation was a recurring threat. The marrow of a single deer contains perhaps 1,000 calories, concentrated nutrition sealed within bone, protected from the bacteria and scavengers that would claim exposed meat. Our ancestors learned to reach this hidden cache, to break the bones with stones and suck out the soft, fatty tissue within. It was often the difference between death and survival. At sites in northern Siberia, archaeologists have found evidence of even more extreme measures. Animal hides, normally reserved for clothing and shelter, show cut marks consistent with consumption. The hides were boiled for hours, sometimes days, until they softened enough to chew and swallow. They provided almost no nutrition in the conventional sense, but they gave the stomach something to work on, something to fill the gnawing emptiness. And the collagen they contained could be partially converted to usable energy. Similar evidence has been found in Inuit winter camps, where every part of every animal was used, where nothing was wasted because waste meant death. The social dynamics of starvation reveal aspects of human nature that are both troubling and profound. In many traditional societies, elaborate rules govern the distribution of food during times of scarcity. These rules were not arbitrary. They were the product of countless generations of trial and error, optimized by natural selection to maximize the survival of the group as a whole. In some cultures, children and pregnant women received priority, their survival representing the future of the community. In others, the most skilled hunters were fed first, even at the expense of the vulnerable, because their strength was essential to ending the famine when opportunity arose. These decisions were agonizing, and they left scars on the psyche of every person who made them, but they were made nonetheless. They had to be made. The alternative was the death of everyone. The psychology of waiting during starvation is perhaps the least understood aspect of this experience. Modern humans are accustomed to action, to solving problems through intervention, to doing something when confronted with crisis. But in the deepest winters, action was often impossible. There was nothing to hunt, nothing to gather, nothing to do but wait. This waiting required a mental discipline that most modern people have never developed. A capacity for stillness that approaches the meditative, a willingness to exist in the present moment without grasping at a future that might never arrive. The elders in these communities often became the anchors of psychological stability. They told stories, not to entertain but to structure time, to give the mind something to hold on to besides hunger. They reminded the others of winters that had ended, of springs that had eventually come, of ancestors who had survived worse and passed down their strength through blood and memory. The grease of animals was one of the most precious substances in these survival calculations. Rendered fat from bears, seals, caribou, and other large mammals could be stored for months without spoiling. It provided more than twice the calories of protein or carbohydrate per gram, and it burned clean and hot when used for fuel. Communities that had access to grease could survive winters that would have killed others. The archaeological record shows that grease production was a major activity during the autumn months, when animals were at their fattest. Every scrap of fat was carefully collected, heated until it liquefied, and stored in containers made of skin or bark. This grease was not merely food. It was currency, security, life insurance against the killing season. The physiological adaptations that allow humans to survive extended fasting are the result of selective pressures applied over millions of years. Our ancestors did not evolve in a world of constant abundance. They evolved in a world of feast and famine, of seasons when food was plentiful and seasons when it vanished entirely. The human body became remarkably efficient at storing energy during times of plenty and rationing it during times of scarcity. The fat cells that modern people often regard as unsightly are actually sophisticated energy storage systems, capable of holding reserves sufficient for weeks or even months of survival. The liver developed the capacity to produce ketones, alternative fuel molecules that the brain can use when glucose is unavailable. The kidneys developed the ability to concentrate urine, conserving water when none could be found. Every system in the human body carries the imprint of ancestral starvation, shaped by the simple fact that individuals who could not survive periods without food did not become ancestors at all. But survival was not merely physical. The archaeological record suggests that symbolic and spiritual practices intensified during times of extreme scarcity. Cave paintings from periods of climate stress show an increased focus on animals, as if the act of depicting prey could somehow summon it back into existence. Burial practices became more elaborate, perhaps reflecting a heightened awareness of death and a corresponding need to assert meaning in its face. Ritual objects, carved from bone and ivory, appear with greater frequency in layers dating to the hardest periods. These were not luxuries. They were survival tools of a different kind, technologies for maintaining the psychological coherence necessary to endure. The ending of a starvation period was not a sudden event, but a gradual one. The first signs of spring came slowly, almost imperceptibly, a slight softening in the quality of the light, a barely audible drip of meltwater somewhere beneath the snow, the return of a single bird, spotted against the gray sky for just a moment before vanishing. These signs were not enough to provide food, not yet, but they were enough to provide something equally essential: hope. The people began to stir, to speak again, to move with slightly more purpose. They had survived, not through strength or violence or any of the qualities that modern narratives celebrate. They had survived through patience, through stillness, through the ancient human capacity to endure what cannot be changed and wait for what might eventually come. The marrow bones were cracked on the 14th day of that long winter. Not the bones of fresh kills, for there were no fresh kills, but bones that had been saved from autumn, stored against exactly this contingency. The elders had known this moment would come. They had prepared for it, hiding the bones even from the other members of the group, knowing that hunger makes people desperate and desperation makes people unwise. Now, in the darkest hour, they brought out the reserve. The marrow was old and rancid, but it was still fat, still calories, still life. It bought them another 3 days. And on the 17th day, one of the hunters spotted tracks in the snow. A single deer, weakened by winter, moving slowly through the drifts. The hunt was careful, patient, utterly silent. Every ounce of remaining strength was focused on this one chance. And when the deer fell, there was no celebration. There was only a quiet gratitude, a recognition that the world had relented at last, that the long wait was finally over. Studies of human remains from archaeological sites of recurring famine show distinctive patterns of stress. Harris lines and long bones mark periods when growth stopped due to nutritional deficiency, then resumed when food returned. Dental enamel hypoplasia creates visible bands in teeth, recording childhood episodes of severe malnutrition. These markers appear with remarkable frequency in remains from the Pleistocene and early Holocene, suggesting that our ancestors experienced starvation not as an exceptional event but as a regular feature of life. They survived it not once but many times, across many generations, and each survival refined the biological and cultural adaptations that made future survival possible. The metabolic legacy of this history remains with us today. The human body still responds to caloric restriction with the same ancient protocols, slowing metabolism, increasing hunger hormones, fighting to preserve fat reserves against future scarcity. These responses, which once saved lives, now contribute to the obesity epidemic in societies of unprecedented abundance. But they remind us of something important about who we are and where we came from. We are the descendants of survivors, not the fastest or the strongest or even the smartest, but those who could wait, who could endure, who could find stillness in the face of terror and maintain hope in the face of despair. The winter eventually ended. It always ends, though never soon enough, never without cost. The snow began to melt, first in patches, then in streams, then in floods that swept away the accumulated weight of months. The animals returned, cautiously at first, then in greater numbers. The people emerged from their shelters, blinking in the unfamiliar brightness, their bodies diminished, but alive. They did not speak of what they had endured. Some experiences exist beyond language, beyond narrative, beyond any frame that words can provide. But they remembered. And when autumn came again, they began preparing for the next winter, storing food and fat and marrow bone, knowing that the cold would return, knowing that the world would withdraw its mercy once more, knowing that survival would depend on the same ancient discipline that had seen them through before. The child who had watched the snow through the gap in the shelter wall grew up to become an elder herself, many years later, in a winter very much like the one she had survived. And when the food ran out and the people began to despair, she gathered them close and told them stories. Stories of patience, of waiting, of ancestors who had faced the same emptiness and found within themselves the strength to endure. She did not promise that spring would come. She could not make that promise. But she reminded them that it had come before, that it had always come before, and that their task was simply to be present when it arrived, to wait, to endure, to survive through patience, as humans always had, as humans always would. The silence returned to the valley. The snow continued to fall, and somewhere beneath the frozen earth, in roots too deep for winter to reach, life waited for its season to begin again.